A Fatal Dose of Gossip, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins not with a weapon, but with a whisper. In St. Mary Mead, gossip travels faster than truth, passed from doorstep to doorstep, shaped by curiosity, sharpened by suspicion. Most of it is harmless, until one particular rumor begins to spread. At first it seems trivial, a careless comment, a story slightly altered with each telling, but then someone dies. The villagers call it a coincidence. Miss Marple does not. She notices how the story changed, who repeated it, and who seemed far too interested in keeping it alive, because gossip doesn't become deadly on its own. Someone guides it. And in this quiet village, words have become the perfect weapon, leaving no trace and yet causing undeniable harm. Before we uncover who turned gossip into something fatal, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Whispers That Kill. It started, as these things often do, with something small, a whisper, a sideways glance over teacups, the sort of thing people brush off with a shrug, until it begins to linger, until it settles in the mind and refuses to leave. St. Mary Mead had felt unsettled for days, not in any loud or obvious way, no broken windows, no raised voices in the street, just a quiet sort of unease, like a draft slipping under a door. People paused a second too long before speaking, doors closed a touch quicker than usual, and conversations, perfectly ordinary ones, had a habit of stopping the moment someone new appeared. At the center of it all, quite unmistakably, was Mrs. Clara Henshaw. Clara was not, at first glance, a remarkable woman, neatly dressed, always well presented, with a pleasant enough smile. But it was her manner that set her apart. She had a way of leaning in, lowering her voice just slightly, and saying something that sounded harmless until one thought about it later. Then it became something else entirely. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing," she would murmur, "but I did hear the most curious thing." And that was quite enough. Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting resting lightly in her lap, had observed this pattern with growing interest. She did not interfere, she rarely did, but she watched, and more importantly, she listened. Human nature, she often said, was much the same everywhere, only the scale changed. And Clara Henshaw, she thought, was playing a dangerous sort of game. The unease reached its quiet peak at the Bantry's luncheon. It was meant to be a pleasant affair, a gathering of familiar faces, polished silver and well-prepared dishes, the sort of occasion where everyone knew exactly how to behave. And on the surface it was just that. Smiles were exchanged, compliments given, the air filled with the soft clink of china and the gentle murmur of polite conversation. But beneath it, something else moved. Clara arrived slightly late, which in itself drew attention. She apologized with a light laugh, brushing it off as though it were nothing at all, yet within minutes she had begun her quiet circuit of the room. She spoke first to Mrs. Price Ridley, who stiffened almost at once, then to young Mr. Ellis, whose cheerful expression faded rather quickly. A hand placed lightly on an arm, a few words murmured just out of reach, and then Clara would move on, leaving behind a faint but unmistakable tension. Miss Marple noticed every one of these small exchanges, the way eyes followed Clara as she crossed the room, the way conversations faltered in her wake. It was not affection she inspired, nor even simple curiosity, it was unease. By the time tea was served, the atmosphere had tightened considerably. Cups were lifted, saucers steadied with careful hands, and still Clara spoke, her voice weaving in and out of the room like a thread pulled just a little too tight. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting untouched now, her gaze thoughtful. And then, quite suddenly, everything changed. Clara stood near the center of the room, teacup in hand, mid-conversation. Her voice carried just enough for a few nearby guests to hear. And of course, one must wonder what people would say if they knew— She stopped. Not dramatically, not at first. Just a pause, a slight falter, as though she had lost her place. Her hand trembled. The teacup rattled softly against the saucer, a small, brittle sound that seemed far louder than it ought to have been. Someone turned, then another. Clara's expression shifted. Confusion, perhaps, or something closer to alarm. The cup slipped from her fingers. It struck the floor and shattered, the sound sharp and final. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Clara swayed, her hand reaching out as though for support that wasn't there, and in the next instant she collapsed. Not gracefully, not slowly, but all at once, as though something within her had simply given way. A chair scraped harshly. Someone cried out. Another voice called her name, too loudly, too late. The calm of the luncheon dissolved into chaos. People rushed forward, then hesitated, no one quite sure what to do, or perhaps unwilling to be the first to act. The broken china lay across the carpet, tea spreading in a dark, creeping stain. Miss Marple did not move at once. She watched the stillness of Clara's form, the unnatural angle of her hand, the silence that followed, heavy and absolute. When at last she rose, it was with quiet deliberation. She set her knitting aside, smoothing it gently, as though the small act might steady the moment. "Best not to crowd her," she said softly, though her eyes remained fixed on Clara. There was no need for a doctor to say it, not really. The truth settled over the room with a cold certainty. Clara Henshaw was dead. Later, there would be talk, plenty of it, there always is. Words like poison and dose and deliberate would be whispered behind closed doors, the sort of words that change everything. But in that moment, as the afternoon light dimmed and the room fell into uneasy silence, Miss Marple understood something rather simple. Clara Henshaw dealt in whispers, and somewhere along the line, one of them had turned deadly. Chapter 2. The Truth Beneath the Talk. The village did not sleep well that night. It never does after something like that. Curtains twitched long after dark, and lamps burned later than usual. People told themselves they were only talking things through, but talk in St. Mary Mead has a way of turning. By morning the whispers had already begun again, only now they carried a sharper edge. Poison, that was the word being passed about, quietly, of course, respectfully, but firmly. Clara Henshaw hadn't simply collapsed. No, something had been done, something deliberate, and worse still, it had been done in a room full of familiar faces. Inspector Slack arrived before noon, bringing with him an air of brisk importance and just too much confidence. He asked his questions in a loud, steady voice, as though the truth might reveal itself if spoken to firmly enough. Names were taken, times were noted, movements recalled, corrected, then recalled again. Everyone had seen something, or thought they had. Miss Marple, as it happened, had seen rather more than most, though she said very little. She listened. She listened to Mrs. Price Ridley insist that Clara had been perfectly normal, which in itself meant very little.
She listened to young Mr. Ellis describe a most peculiar look on Clara's face, though he could not quite explain what made it so. And she listened with particular care to the quieter remarks, the ones spoken in lowered tones, half-finished, as though the speaker wasn't entirely certain they wished to be heard. One detail returned again and again. Clara had been talking, not idly, not casually, but with purpose. Several guests recalled her drawing them aside, one by one, a word here, a suggestion there, enough to unsettle, enough to leave a mark. Inspector Slack, for all his noise, missed the shape of it entirely. "It's opportunity we're looking for," he declared. "Access to the tea, a moment alone with the cup." Miss Marple gave a small, polite nod, though her eyes suggested something else entirely. Opportunity mattered, yes, of course it did, but motive, that was where the truth lived, and Clara Henshaw, she suspected, had left quite a trail behind her. One name in particular began to surface, not loudly, not directly, but often enough to be noticed. Mrs. Eliza Trent. A composed woman, well regarded, the sort who kept her affairs in perfect order and her emotions neatly tucked away. No one spoke against her outright, that would have been improper, but there were glances, hesitations, a certain carefulness when her name was mentioned. Clara had spoken to her just before the luncheon, more than spoken, perhaps. Miss Marple called upon her that afternoon. Eliza Trent received her in a tidy sitting-room, everything in its proper place. The curtains were drawn just so, the furniture arranged with quiet precision. Even the tea-tray seemed arranged with more strictly necessary. "Eliza, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, settling into her chair, "such dreadful business yesterday." "Quite dreadful," Eliza replied, her voice steady, too steady. They spoke at first of ordinary things, the weather, the village, the unfortunate nature of sudden illness. But Miss Marple did not rush. She never did. She allowed the silence to stretch just a little longer than comfortable. And then, softly, she asked, "You spoke with Clara, I believe, just before tea." A pause. Very slight, barely there. "Yes," Eliza said at last, "only briefly." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "Clara did so enjoy her little conversations." Eliza's hands, resting neatly in her lap, tightened just a fraction. "She had a habit," Miss Marple went on, her tone mild, almost absent, "of knowing things, or suggesting she did. It can be unsettling." Eliza did not reply at once. When she did, her voice was measured, careful. "People do exaggerate." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "they do." Silence followed, not empty, but full, the sort that presses gently at the edges of a person's composure. Miss Marple rose soon after, offering polite farewells, her expression as kindly as ever. But as she stepped out into the cool afternoon air, her thoughts were already aligning. Clara Henshaw had not simply gossiped. She had used what she knew, or what she claimed to know, and she had chosen her moments with care. A word in the wrong ear, at the wrong time, a hint of something dangerous. Miss Marple walked slowly back towards her cottage, her hands folded lightly before her. Fear, she thought, was a curious thing, quiet, invisible, and yet, when stirred, it could push even the most composed person to act. Clara had stirred something. Not anger, not quite. Something deeper than that. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone had decided that silence was worth any price.
The truth, when it came, did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It never does in St. Mary Mead. It settles, quietly, like dust in a room no one has entered for years, until suddenly everything is clear. Miss Marple chose her moment with care. The Bantry's drawing room, once again, the very same space where Clara Henshaw had taken her final breath. The chairs arranged much as they had been before, though no one seemed entirely at ease in them now. Familiar surroundings, yes, but touched by something colder. Inspector Slack stood near the mantel, arms folded, his expression firm in that way men adopt when they wish to appear certain. The others gathered slowly, speaking in low voices that faded as Miss Marple entered. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. "I believe," she said gently, taking her seat, "that we've all been thinking along rather complicated lines." A few glances were exchanged. No one interrupted. "It is tempting," she went on, "to imagine something elaborate, something clever, but human nature, in my experience, is rarely so inventive. It is simpler and far more troubling." Her eyes moved, not hurriedly, but with quiet purpose, until they rested on Eliza Trent. Eliza sat very still. "Clara Henshaw," Miss Marple continued, "had a most unfortunate habit. She liked to suggest she knew things, and often she did know just enough to be dangerous, not because of what she said outright, but because of what she implied." A faint shift passed through the room. "She spoke to several of you that afternoon, left each of you with a question, a doubt, something to trouble the mind. But with Mrs. Trent it was rather different." Eliza's gaze did not waver, though something in her expression tightened just slightly. "She did not merely hint," she said softly. "She pressed. She made it clear that she knew something that could not be allowed to spread." Inspector Slack straightened a little. "Are you suggesting—" "Yes," Miss Marple said, with quiet certainty. "I am." Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable. It was not anger, not a sudden quarrel, nor a moment of temper. It was fear, the sort of fear that grows very still and then acts all at once. Her gaze remained steady on Eliza. "A small vial," she said, "nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. A measured amount, added at precisely the right moment. Clara's teacup was left unattended, however briefly. That was all the opportunity required." No one moved. Eliza's hands, resting in her lap, slowly came together, fingers interlacing as though holding something in place. "She gave you no choice," Eliza said at last, her voice low, controlled. "Yes, I believe she did." There was no outburst, no denial, only a long, quiet breath, as though something heavy had finally been set down. "I couldn't let it come out. You don't understand what it would have done." "No, I imagine I do." Inspector Slack stepped forward then, the moment breaking at last into action. His voice returned, firm and official, though it seemed almost too loud for the room. Eliza did not resist. She rose calmly, her composure returning in that curious way it sometimes does when there is nothing left to hide. And just like that, it was over. Or so it seemed. Later, the village began its slow, careful return to normal. Curtains opened again, conversations resumed, though softer now, and with a touch more caution. Names were still spoken, of course, they always are, but something had changed. Miss Marple sat once more by her window, her knitting in hand, the steady click of needles filling the quiet room. "Gossip," she murmured, almost to herself, "is rather like poison. A drop or two may do no harm at all, but given freely, without thought."
She let the words trail off, unfinished. Outside, a pair of neighbors paused to speak, their voices low, curious, careful. Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest smile. Because it never truly ends, you see. If you enjoy stories where the smallest whisper can lead to something far darker, stay with us. There's always another secret waiting just beneath the surface, and the next one might be even more dangerous.